Hi, I'm Richard Dolman. I'm going to share an excerpt from a previous video where I'm responding to a question by a subscriber on the Agile Network who asked for advice on how to address resistance to introducing cross-functional teams and other related Agile approaches given his organization's hierarchical control culture. It provides a glimpse into the competing values framework and how it can be used to create cultural awareness and to help negotiate and manage the tensions that exist between organizational norms and change. So, Mark, I understand you're looking to recommend some changes for your organization, including forming cross functional teams. And you're curious about how that's going to work given your organization's hierarchical culture. So, for the purposes of this topic, I'm going to use what's called the competing values framework. So if you're already familiar with this framework, feel free to skip ahead a little bit. But I'm going to provide a real quick overview of the framework, and then we'll talk about your specific questions. So for starters, as you'll notice, this is a real simple quadrant-based model. Starting over here at the upper right, we have a culture type referred to as clan, or we often refer to that as a collaborative culture. Over here on the upper right, we've got an adhocracy culture type, which we refer to as creative culture. Down here, we've got a market culture type. We're going to refer to that as a competing culture. And then over here in the lower left, we have a hierarchy type, which we're going to refer to as a controlling culture. Now, you notice on the boundaries here, there are some descriptions of what the focus areas are. So for these top two quadrants, we're focused more on flexibility and discretion. Whereas on these bottom two quadrants, we're focusing more on stability and control. Now, on the right-hand side, there's more of an external focused, whereas the left side quadrants are more internally focused. Okay. Now, a couple of quick points about this model. First, there are no good or bad cultures. In fact, most organizations have and need elements of all four of these culture types. But it's very common, which might be the case in your company, that there's a predominant or a dominant culture, and we'll explore that a little bit. The second key point is understanding there's this level of tension that exists across these quadrants. The highest level of tension is going to exist as we're traversing on the diagonal. So if we're currently in the hierarchy and control culture, but we're trying to move more into an adhocracy or creative culture, there's going to be some tension that exists there. And that's tension is what we have to negotiate as we're trying to bring about certain change. There's also tension between the adjacent quadrants, but that tension might be a little bit less because there's at least one element of shared focus between those quadrants. Okay. So let's take a look at this model using your specific ideas and questions. So again, you mentioned that your organization is predominantly a hierarchy culture. So we'll place that in the lower left. And again, we refer to that as controlling culture orientation. And so let's talk about this topic of cross-functional teams. So for me, cross-functional teams as a starting point, I'm just going to drop it kind of on the line between collaborative and creative. It certainly lands in these two top quadrants because for cross-functional teams, there's an assumption, certainly for agile teams, that we also have some level of autonomy, some level of self-organization that happens there. And so naturally we want to have an orientation around collaboration, but we also want to have some of that adhocracy built into it. I'm going to slide it a little bit over to the right because I think the real challenge that you're going to have, the tension that you're going to have is really that tension that exists in that creative quadrant. So again, if your organization is down here in command and control, but you're trying to introduce new ideas, new ways of working like cross-functional teams, there's going to be some tension that exists between your predominant cultural orientation and this more adhocracy or creative type of a culture. Now, you can mitigate that tension simply by negotiating with those individuals that are most closely attached to or in a decision-making role when it comes to things that impact your hierarchy or that impact any control mechanisms you need to have in your organization. So cross-functional teams, by definition, likely mean that you're going to impact your hierarchy, because you're likely going to have to traverse your hierarchy to be able to get all of the people with the skill sets you need. And this is a very common challenge that I see across all of my clients. I'm actually dealing with that with one of my new clients right now. So what I do is I simply negotiate with all of the key decision makers based on that hierarchy. Okay. So if I need someone from, let's say, development part of the organization, someone from, let's say, infrastructure part of the organization, then I need to go talk to those leaders and make sure they understand what we're trying to accomplish and why we need their people, and also be prepared to negotiate and address any concerns they have around their level of control based on their hierarchy. So it's certainly doable, but you have to be sensitive to that tension, and you have to be sensitive to the needs of those people that are most closely attached to that hierarchy and to that controlling culture. Okay. Now, you also mentioned the need to maybe bring in this technique of minimum viable product. Great technique. I'm going to drop it pretty squarely on the line between creative and competing. So one dimension of MVP is going to fall in that creative space. We expect, if we're going to use minimum viable product as a technique, we're going to make sure that we're giving the product owner or product owners as much autonomy as possible so that they can make those decisions. We also want the teams to be having some level of autonomy so that they can help negotiate with the product owner what makes sense that goes into the first MVP versus some subsequent release. Okay. So again, you're going to have that same tension as you have in cross-functional teams. You're going to have to negotiate any of the hierarchical challenges, and you're going to have to negotiate also any controls that go into this. One of the control challenges you're likely going to have is if you've got, let's say, a PMO or a part of the organization that's responsible for big project planning or release management, you'll have to negotiate with those individuals as well. Beyond negotiation, what I recommend is actually invite them into the process of defining MVP, at least get some representation in the room when you're doing some of that. So that will start to mitigate some of that tension. Now, the other dimension of MVP will actually be less tension, because it's about delivering quickly to your customer or to the market. So the second dimension of MVP comes a little bit more squarely down into competing. And as we've already talked about, competing culture has shared focus on stability and control with hierarchy and control. So you'll have much less tension that exists on that dimension or that aspect of MVP, which might be a good place to start, because if you can alleviate that tension and get people connected with, I understand why we're trying to do this, and we're going to get product to the market faster, we're going to validate our hypothesis faster, we're going to satisfy our customers, we'll have that stability control. That'll make the other conversations you need about any impact it has on other controls much easier for you to navigate. Okay. Now, you also referenced iterative development. I'm going to put iterative development mostly in the creative quadrant, a little bit down in competing. We all know that iterative and incremental delivery is important, particularly when we're dealing with complexity. So similar to cross-functional teams, you need to understand it's probably not going to impact your hierarchy quite as much, but I'm sure you're going to have some tension between any of those control mechanisms that are in place, whether it's project processes, PMO processes, waterfall processes, documentation processes, etc. So you'll have to navigate similar challenges and similar tension as you did with cross-functional teams, but you can also, again, leverage the aspect that you're going to get things to your customers faster, which gives you more stability from a product delivery perspective. So you can navigate that tension. You mentioned dependency management. So the first dimension of dependency management to me really comes up under collaboration, right? How do we collaborate together to deliver our products? And while the first element of that starts up in collaboration, once we start to get the management of those dependencies in place, we actually start to move down into the control area. Now, there's an element of creative and competing that exists there, but I don't want to spread it too thin. But when we're talking about dependency management, you're likely to have much less tension, because in fact, what you're trying to do is you're trying to mitigate the risk of all of these dependencies. You're trying to get a control over how you manage those dependencies and all of the risks and gaps that might create. So that actually lines up very, very well with a hierarchy and a command control culture. Now, again, as far as hierarchy concerns, anything that goes into dependency management that puts some friction around your hierarchy, you'll have to deal with. But I'm guessing that's going to be very low, and you'll see much better alignment there between the collaborative and the controlling cultures. You also mentioned release trains. Again, similarly, release trains as a starting point, it's really about collaboration. How do we all work together to deliver our products consistently? There's also an element of creative in there, because sometimes it's more art than science, trying to figure out what does your value stream really look like and how are you going to design that release train so that you can meet the objectives of the value stream. But once your release train gets rolling, right, it is really in the sweet spot, I believe, of the controlling culture as well as the competing culture, because we're managing, we're controlling how we release our product. The train is on time, it's got a regular schedule, we can depend on it, and we know that we're managing the release of our products much more consistently. Now, you also mentioned rapid growth, and I'm guessing that this is probably your overarching challenge, right? And rapid growth is testing and creating tension, I am sure, in all four of these quadrants. So from a hierarchy perspective, my guess is, you probably can't adapt your hierarchy fast enough if you're hiring a lot of new people. Maybe you've got managers and leaders that are all of a sudden overloaded because they've got all these people that they're having to take care of now. But the best way to deal with rapid growth is really to lean in on all four of these dimensions of this quadrant model, right? Focus on what's important to you as an organization from a collaboration perspective. Focus on what's important to you from a creative perspective, from a competing perspective, and certainly from a hierarchical or a controlling perspective. So this one's really tricky. It's really nebulous, but my advice there would be kind of leverage all four of these quadrants. And again, when you see tension emerging relative to this, negotiate in similar fashion as I described in some of these other potential ideas. So I want to give you a couple of key points to take away, and hopefully it will help you apply some of this in your organization. So point number one is understand that tension that I referenced that exists between these quadrants. It's natural, but part of the challenge is how do you manage and dampen down some of that tension? So understand the tension and leverage all of the elements of this quadrant model, right? I'm guessing you've got elements of all of these cultures in your organization. So leverage them as you're trying to bring some of this change into the organization. Point number two, align on your why. Simply put, you need to get alignment and agreement on what is the intent of doing these things and what is the desired outcome. So if you're trying to create or form more cross-functional teams, be sure you can explain why it's important to you, what the outcome or the intent of that is, and that will allow people to get aligned to the idea, and then you can start negotiating any resistance that you might see. Point number three, treat each of these ideas potentially as an experiment. Now, I'm going to emphasize that you want to bring discipline into your experiments, because experimentation certainly lives up in that create quadrant, right? We're dealing with complexity, we need to iterate, so we use a lot of experimentation. Most organizations kind of treat experimentation as this loose thing. If you bring discipline into your experimentation, you will be speaking the language of those people down in the control quadrant, because you're going to say, this is the time box we're going to use, these are the variables we're going to be focusing on, these are the constraints that we have, and at the end of this experiment, we'll have this data and we'll be able to make a decision. Again, you're speaking their language, but you've got to have that discipline. Point number four, engagement. Make sure you're involving your skeptics as well as your champions in these initiatives. I'm a firm believer, let's get the skeptics to the table along with the champions. That way we can all collaborate on trying to get the best outcome possible. The question is not, do cross-functional teams work? The question is, how do they work in your organization given your culture orientation? Point number five, and this is probably obvious, is transparency. Keep things out in the open and always remember to inspect and adapt. So I hope this was helpful for you. Good luck introducing some of these ideas into your organization. If you found this helpful and you want to learn more or discuss how you might introduce this to your organization, use the QR code to book a call or look me up on LinkedIn or go to my website, millenniumcoaching.com. If you